Hi, everyone. Our discussion today will be devoted to the measures of discrimination um, along racial lines that were put into place during the segregation era. And it's important to make connections here to establish some continuity. One of the things that hopefully you'll notice is that a lot of these measures, uh, in many cases, are sort of sanctioned or codified in laws in this period, but these had already been in place, put into place by individuals, by companies, especially by things like the diamond and gold mines in the previous period. It's also important to look forward here and see that the measures of the segregation era will be extended and achieve their full development during the apartheid period, right? So there's really a lot of continuity between the 19th and early 20th centuries, and again between the early 20th and the mid to late 20th century with the system of apartheid. One of the most important and we might say inhumane aspects of the segregation system that was put into place in South Africa, and again the apartheid system, of the mid 20th century was, well, in the segregation era, ensconced in a law called the Natives Land Act in 1913. By this law, Africans could not own land in any of the white-controlled areas of South Africa. They were instead given land ownership rights only in these territories that were designated by the South African government as native reserves. And so you might ask, okay, how much of South Africa was this, right? Now, this map is actually from a later period. I think this says 1970 right there. And you can see that all of these lands in kind of this gray color, right, were part of the system that under apartheid was called the homelands. But these stemmed from the native reserves. Now, the Natives Land Act initially allowed for only 7%, and that's not a typo, 7% of the land of South Africa to be handed to black Africans. They did put a provision in this that the government would quickly designate more land and would use government revenue to purchase more land to hand over to the native reserves. However, there was always a great deal of opposition to increase in this total. Whites were eager to snatch up more and more land, and especially the best farmland. And so, when the government made moves over the course of the next decade or two to increase the size of the native reserves, there was always a lot of protest. It was the the Botha Smuts government that had passed this law after Herzog was put into charge in the government in 1924. There was a great deal more opposition to this, even though those in the highest echelons of power did occasionally recognize that giving the vast majority of the population only 7 or a little bit more percent of the land was simply untenable. There was enough political headwind that it never made it much further than that. At its height, a piece of 1936 legislation increased the total area of reserves to 11.7% of the total landmass of South Africa. Under apartheid, this would grow only to 13%. This all the while as the black population was growing precipitously with a much higher birth rate than the white population. And so the white population as a percentage of the total population of South Africa was shrinking, and blacks were limited to only that amount of land, right? Now, really, I mean, I think it's necessary to say this whole thing is really a sham, because the black Africans really didn't control, at least not in any really meaningful way, any of these territories other than they did have land ownership rights in them. Now, what happened on these reserves? Well, often this land that was designated as for the natives was marginal. The best farmland was taken by whites, and given that these Africans were all pretty much all rural farmers, having the best farmland snatched away from them, being limited to marginal land, was absolutely disastrous. The South African government provided no subsidies or infrastructure or anything. They didn't build water systems, irrigation systems, anything for sanitation or public health. None of that was put into place on the reserves. And so, we have essentially a situation where a huge population in some cases was living on marginal land with no infrastructure, no toilets, no effective sanitation. Fresh water systems were few and far between. They had wells, but often people had to walk a significant distance to get to the wells. And what farmland did exist in these reserves was quickly depleted of its nutrients. Soil erosion and other things further compromised the ability people had to eke out any kind of existence from the land, right? And so this was just a disastrous situation. The population density in these places was, in some instances at least, breathtaking, right? And we'll talk about what happens under apartheid, where a very small reserve like Kwakwa, there are two clicks in that, it's a tough word to say, ends up having a population density of something like 800 people per square mile. Which is totally ridiculous, right? And just completely unable to support the population. But we'll save some of that discussion for the apartheid period. The only option that people had, given these horrific living conditions on the reserves, was to seek employment in the white areas, either on farms or, more likely, in the cities, in the mines, and in the growing manufacturing sector of the South African economy. But as we'll see on the next slide, there were serious consequences to making that choice in terms of social disruption, complete isolation from anything familiar, and a host of other severe consequences to Black African society. Now, with the proclamation, or rather the passage of the Natives Land Act, land that was in black hands, either from claims of ownership that in some cases extended back many generations, or because the Black Africans had set up some sort of sharecropping arrangement with often absentee landlords. In any case, there were a lot of mass evictions of Black people, in many cases from land, as I said, that they had been on for generations, and they were told that their place was in the reserve. In many cases, these people had never even been to the reserve, had no connection to it at all, and so the social dislocation caused by this was also severe, right? As people were evicted, a Xhosa person, for instance, living, somewhere here in the Eastern Cape, would be told that their reserve was in the Transkei, and so they were kicked off of their farmland and forced to journey, in some cases, dozens or hundreds of miles, and go to some place they had no familiarity with no supporting social infrastructure or anything like that. So you can see how just horrifically unfair this is, right? And it's going to get worse. Now, other forms of discrimination. That one is, you have to understand the concept of the reserves, and we're going to keep track of this and see, what the South African government tries to do under apartheid with the concept of reserves, the creation of these homelands, the attempts to, make them kind of independent but not independent, and things like this. Now, thousands, ultimately millions of Black Africans made their way in the 20th century to the urban setting to try to find employment, to try to eke out some sort of existence so that they could send money home to their families on the reserves, and support those who were dear to them. And so just, I mean, and there's also the general trend of whites moving to the cities. Even though blacks only about, I think about mid-century, only about a quarter of all of the black people of South Africa lived in cities, that population of blacks exceeded the whites in the urban space, actually by a significant amount, even though something like 70 to 75% of all white South Africans lived in the cities. And so, I mean, there's just a general demographic trend toward urbanization. The whites were concerned that blacks would take up permanent residence in the cities. They did not want them there as permanent residents. They didn't acknowledge, given the Native Land Act and some other supporting legislation, that the blacks had any right to own land or to have permanent residence anywhere in the white areas, right? And so they put into place a series of discriminatory laws to drive that message home and to make it clear that the cities belong to white people. One of the most insidious of these was the system of pass laws, and there were several of these. We could go into the details of these. This is a pass. I'm not sure when exactly this is from, actually. I think that says 1923 there, but I'm not. The print is fairly small. So this seems to be a fairly early one. Put simply, black Africans to live in a city, to seek employment there, had to obtain a pass from the government. And these passes were for limited terms. Usually the initial pass was for just a few days, where the black African could spend a little time, very little time, only a few days, trying to find employment. They had to show their pass to any police officer or other authority who asked for it. And then the pass had to be signed or stamped by an employer who offered employment to the laborer, and they had to be able to produce the pass on a constant basis while they were under their contract of employment. Once the contract of employment was up, the pass also expired, and they would have to obtain another one of these. This is a bureaucratic nightmare. If you've ever felt inconvenienced, going into some government agency, going to the Department of Motor Vehicles or something like that, I will say that's gotten a lot better in recent years. This is what a black African in South Africa had to face on a constant basis, right? Getting the paperwork done so that they could simply try to live their lives and make a living for their families. The largest employer, at least early in the 20th century, of black Africans were the gold mines around Johannesburg in the Witwatersrand region. And in fact, there was a massive effort by the gold mines to recruit African laborers within South Africa on the native reserves, but also in surrounding countries. Recruiters from the gold mines went into Basotho land and Bechuana land and Swaziland, into Southwest Africa, even up into areas north, into Rhodesia, into Nyasa land, or what later became known as Malawi, into Tanganyika, or what later became known as Tanzania, and so forth and so on, right? So the gold mines brought together a wide and diverse population of Africans from all over the southern part of Africa. In the Thompson book, he noted that a census of these workers in the mid-30s showed that about a little more than 50% of the laborers in the mines came from South Africa itself, and only a little bit less than 50% came from other countries, especially Mozambique was the largest supplier outside of South Africa. And I will say, even in the mid-90s, when I lived in South Africa, I met workers in the mines who were from Mozambique, so this practice continued. In 1911, the government passed a law that really gave legal sanction to a practice that was already in place, and that is that all of the skilled positions in the mines and in manufacturing would be in the hands of white people. That a black person legally could not have a skilled labor position. Okay. There were black supervisors. They called them indunas, which is a Nguni word for chief. And down in the mines themselves, the vast majority of the ones working at the on the stopes at the rock face were black, right? I mean, these are the unskilled positions were tremendously difficult things to do. I mean, the amount of manual labor required at this, they would often have to blast or cut the rock in a crouched position, and so the strain on the body was just tremendous. So the conditions in the mines were absolutely horrific. When blacks tried to press for some sort of overturning of the Mines and Works Act, some sort of mitigation of their conditions, better treatment, higher wages, more privileges, more benefits. There was resistance to this, both on the part of the white workers in the mines and on the part of the government. Over the course of, well, especially during the Herzog administration, there was tremendous resistance to the called for increases in African labor. And we talked about this a little bit. The mines were worried that their profit margins were not high enough, especially after the First World War, when there was a kind of recession. There was a lot of inflation, and the price of gold was quite low, and so the mines weren't making a lot of money, nearly as much as they thought they should, I guess. So they tried to eliminate some of these skilled white positions and put into place more unskilled black African labor positions. And there was a backlash to this. This is the thing that probably took Jan Smuts out of power more than anything else, as he cracked down on some of these striking white workers, even had the army move in, and many of them were killed. And this is the thing that brought Herzog to power. Under Herzog, the proportion of white workers to black workers in the mines actually increased. I think it reached, by the late 1930s, something like 1 white per 7.5 African workers, whereas it had been 9 or 10 or something like that before. And so, I will say this is not a terribly efficient way to do things. Often these skilled positions were redundant, or there just were too many of them because they were created entirely to serve the white community. Conditions in the mines were terrible. The heat and as I said, the conditions working on the rock face and things like that are just awful. But in addition to that, the living conditions of the black workers were horrific. They were not trapped as they had been in earlier ages, especially in the diamond mines in Kimberley, in their compounds for the length of their term, the length of their contract, but they did live in dormitories that had thousands of workers in them. Some of the rooms that they slept in had up to 90 workers in a single room. They were not provided with beds. There were concrete bunks. They slept on these. In some cases, they would construct something that was a bit more comfortable, but there was simply no room to create any kind of private space or comfortable space for anybody. And so, and the food was, while it might have been filling and nutritious, was bland and repetitive, pretty much the same thing every day. And so, this all contributed to the misery of those who were forced to work in the mines because they really had no other alternative. The early 20th century saw a growing new sector of the South African economy, and this was in manufacturing and also in public works. And again, as should be obvious now, was going to be the case. There was strict discrimination between along racial lines. Herzog, in his rhetoric, noted that wages ought to be commensurate, and I'm not quoting exactly, I'm just paraphrasing here. Wages ought to be commensurate with the level of civilization that a worker is accustomed to. And so because white people were accustomed to living in a certain amount of comfort with the trappings and the comforts of civilization around them, they needed to be paid a civilized wage, right? Which really meant a wage they could exist on and even be comfortable on. Whereas uncivilized people would be disoriented by this, that it would be a waste on them, that they were not accustomed to having these kinds of comforts. They were accustomed to, wearing nothing and living in huts and digging with sticks and things like this. I mean, this is really the amount of aloofness that many of these officials in government had about the black existence. And so therefore they don't need, and they would in fact be hurt by paying them too much, right? And so we need to pay them at a level that will keep them in the sort of lifestyle they are accustomed to, an uncivilized or a barbaric lifestyle. So this was the rhetoric of J.B.M. Herzog and those like him, right? In the manufacturing sector, to keep blacks from obtaining skilled positions, the government passed some laws. One of these is the Apprenticeship Act of 1922, which created certain educational qualifications before one could enter apprenticeship into a skilled trade, and this effectively eliminated any possibility of a black person obtaining an internship and thus learning a trade and potentially a skilled position, because they did not have access to any kind of education that would prepare them for that, right? So they were excluded just out of hand automatically. Another of these was the Industrial Conciliation Act, which created, I'm going to look at my notes here, oh yeah, that's right. It excluded Africans from, it excluded them from being defined as employees, right? And so Africans were not technically, according to this act, employees of those they worked for. Thus, they were not entitled to any sort of representation, to any body who would negotiate on their behalf, and that only white workers could organize themselves as laborers. And later the government is going to say blacks are not, things like labor unions are for those who have reached a state of development that is much higher than that the black Africans have reached. Therefore, they should not have labor unions because these would be harmful to their development. This is a really common line of rhetoric that the South African government used over and over again to deny blacks any possibility of improving their lives. It's just that, they haven't reached a level of civilization that would allow them to appreciate these things, therefore they can't have them. Much as in the mines, the racial income gap was precipitous. It wasn't perhaps quite as large as it was in the mines, but even in the best situation, white workers earned at least 5 times as much as a typical black worker in this sector. I said strikes and trade unions were forbidden. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the attempts of Africans to organize such things in the next lecture. I think a point that is quite obvious, but let me underscore it just briefly, is that this whole system of labor discrimination was horrifically, combined with the reserves, was horrifically catastrophic for the family of the black African, right? Men would have to leave, in some cases, for months at a time without any possibility of going home, seeing their family, seeing their children, in order to get work. Often, they were paid very little, and so, if they squander some of that, or they get it stolen from them, or their worker cheats them out of wages, or I mean, all of these things would leave not only the black worker, not primarily the black worker, but his family at the edge of their existence, because their ability to farm and to earn a living from the land was compromised by the marginal farmland and the soil erosion and the conditions in the homelands. Right. On several occasions, the government, and this again I think is Herzog's rhetoric, passed laws and issued crackdowns to remove what they called surplus females from any of the white areas, right? So men were not allowed to have their families. Housing permits were issued. I think I read only 1% of all South African families were issued a housing permit that would allow them to live in the city as a family unit. So men were living there almost entirely on their own. Okay. Now, blacks did come up with ways to get around this by squatting, by moving on a frequent basis. There were ways to mitigate the effects of the laws, but all of this was done in an illegal fashion, which meant that they were subject to crackdowns by the government frequently. This led to the emergence of what came to be called townships in South Africa. These grew out of the system of locations that were put into place by, well, first by companies like mines and later by the government. By the 1930s, some of these townships had tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people living in them. There was an area just to the southwest of Johannesburg, for instance, kind of surrounded by some of the major mines. It was called Orlando, and that became home to a lot of the blacks who chose to settle there. Some of the housing was provided by the government, but they often simply built very ramshackle dwellings out of corrugated iron and wood and whatever scrap materials they could find. From that emerged ultimately a lot of neighborhoods, whole new divisions, whole new squatter camps. And this came to constitute the area known famously as Soweto. Now that sounds like an African name, but it's actually an acronym. It means Southwest Townships. It has been embraced, and often it's pronounced with a kind of African lilt to it, Soweto, and all of that. But it's from the English Southwest Townships. And Soweto is not the only. It does become the largest of all the townships, but there were others. And in some cases, under apartheid, the government's going to take these townships and kind of incorporate them into the reserves, or into what they come to call the homelands. We'll talk about that later. Lastly, conditions on farms for Africans who worked in that setting were, if anything, worse than those who worked in the urban setting. Though perhaps the likelihood of living together as families on the farms was a bit higher, though it was still discouraged and often simply forbidden. There was almost no supervision or any sort of government oversight or police oversight of the treatment of Africans by white farmers. And given that the relations would have been in a more private context, these were often highly exploitative. In some cases, farmers were somewhat magnanimous to their black employees, but in many cases, they would provide corporal punishment, whippings, or even executing those who they felt had, with the sanction of the law, felt that those who had violated, their contract or stolen something or whatever it was, right? Blacks laws excluded them from sharecropping. They were left entirely to either seek wage labor on the farms or to act as tenant farmers, and that existence was extraordinarily precarious. So these are only, and there's more in this period, but those are perhaps the most important components of a system of segregation that was put into place And we'll talk more about segregation later. Yeah, similar to the Jim Crow laws and things with the uh, separate train platforms, separate toilet facilities, things like this in the urban space. They segregated just about every part of South Africa during this period, and that would become part and parcel of the existence in South Africa as well. But I'll show you some slides of that in a later lecture. Okay, so we'll talk about the black response to this and the attempts to resist the segregation in the next lecture.